So last time, I think my biggest concern at this juncture, and this is very relevant to our consideration of the French Revolution, is the falsification of history and the obscuring of certain lurking, insidious influences that shaped those events and then kind of went back and erased their own footprints from history. And we see what I'm afraid of is something similar happening today in the United States. Here we have Donald Trump, who I think is a truly progressive president. Let's look at some of the things he's done. He threw out the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, which was going to be a global British-style free trade agreement on steroids, which would have multiplied and strengthened the tentacles of the international finance criminal class and subjected all nations to corporate tyranny, authoritarianism, and fascism. And people on the true left, the real progressives, which still exist in small pockets, had been agitating and working to end this move toward the implementation of TPP, which President Obama had been pushing very hard for 8 years. And this would have removed the so perceived barriers that are faced by corporate entities when they go into a country that, of course, this country may wish to protect its national sovereignty, particularly its environmental integrity, its environmental health, and the health of its workers, of its labor force. And TPP would have shredded any country's capability to defend itself and to defend its to defend itself on an existential level, when a corporation can go in and poison the environment, poison the workforce, miserate the people. And there's nothing the country can do about it. If the country attempts to enforce its own environmental regulations, that country can be sued by a kind of corporate kangaroo court tribunal for the losses, the perceived losses of profits that corporation would suffer as a result of a country simply trying to defend itself. You know, this was TPP. This was something that looked like it was inevitable. This was a trade agreement that was ensconced in a 2,000-page document that was not allowed to be read or disseminated or examined by lawmakers or politicians or anyone else. If you wanted to look at it, you were allowed to go sort of quickly kind of skim it for an hour in a room, and you were not allowed to bring your cell phone into that room. You were not allowed to take notes or record anything. You could go look at it for an hour. I was just, appalled that such a thing could be taking place. Such an anti-human, craven plot to further enslave humanity and destroy the environment and weaken the population. And this was something that Obama was pushing for. And the establishment left, the corporate left, the mainstream left that you see now represented in the media and on Capitol Hill and, pretty much mainstream Clinton Democrats, they were all for this. They were all for the exact same kind of corporate fascism that the true left, the real progressives of an earlier era from the 60s and 70s, would have been vehemently opposed to. And there were a few activists who were speaking out against TPP, but they were getting absolutely nowhere because they were up against a real huge, monstrous behemoth. Well, Trump gets into office, and within 3 months, he just throws the thing out. And I was just ecstatic. But it was interesting, you know? No one on the left applauded it. No one wrote about it. No one talked about it. It was as if it just didn't happen. And I thought that was pretty mean-spirited and partisan and ridiculous. They should have recognized that Trump did in 3 months what they had been trying to do for years, and they should have celebrated it. Then you have the First Step Act, where prison reform, freeing people who had been unjustly incarcerated, innocent people incarcerated, people who didn't need to be in prison, opened up the rest of their lives to them, gave them back their lives, you know. And again, the so-called left did not applaud this, did not recognize this, did not publicize it. In fact, they tried to undercut it and downplay it. Then you have the winding down, effectively the ending of these interventionist wars in the Middle East, these horrible bombing campaigns, this destruction of life, and this absolute rampant, bloodthirsty criminality that had been going on through, since 9/11, the Bush administration, and then ramped up under the Obama administration. But no one criticized it because, I remember back in those days, you could not criticize Obama because of what he represented. I called it into question. I asked my friends, I'm like, don't you find it odd that the wars, not only they're still continuing, but they seem to be getting worse? And my so-called leftist friends would get very uncomfortable, and they would sort of let me know in not too subtle ways that we should change the subject. But I never in my heart or in my mind changed the subject. It weighed on me heavily what we were doing in the Middle East and what we represented there. And that it was an enormous overreaction to the perceived or what 9/11 officially represented. Of course, now I know 9/11 was not what they said it was, but this overreaction. So let's see, so what else? Well, there are a number of things that Trump has done that show a true progressive spirit. And my fear at this point is that there will be an attempt among the so-called intelligentsia, who are simply hacks, agents of corporate fascism. And they will attempt to distort history and describe him as some sort of bumbling idiot who wound up in office and threw things into chaos and disarray, but that the new Bolshevik revolution came and sorted everything out and, put us back on the path to becoming one with the Big Brother project that they are planning for us. They've been planning for us for a long time, and they will label it all sorts of beautiful, triumphant words, as they did with the French Revolution, and the truth will be buried, and we absolutely cannot allow that to happen again. We've got to come. Those of us who know the truth have to find a way to broadcast it, to commit it in scholarly ways to the public record, and make sure that the true version of events is available to the future. Otherwise, it will be wiped out, as we see in this article that has happened with the French Revolution. And so interesting how this subject of the Comte de St has led me and sort of coalesced that this, it feels extremely timely to me, because looking in terms of the larger picture, it seems very germane to what we're dealing with, what we're facing now, the possibilities that we're facing, which are just too ugly to consider as far as I'm concerned. So, backing up, it said the Jacobin French Revolution, which was ultimately triggered by the Bastille Day coup, was not only unnecessary but contained the seeds of Napoleonic fascism, detrimental to the nation of France, as we see today with Macron and the rest of the world, obviously, and should have been stopped by all means at the time. The error was never remedied. So this this correction of history was never made. It was never fixed, because the conspiracy to create a national famine that led to Bastille Day was never permitted to be revealed, even though it was widely known to the key players involved in the events of the time. Montjoie's devastating exposé has been buried in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris and ignored by the French intelligentsia ever since its 1796 publication. Well, isn't that unsurprising? I mean, we're dealing with the same thing today. And it's up to us to make sure that it doesn't happen. I was thinking back to the fires in those so-called wildfires in California. Obviously not wildfires. I've seen enough evidence. I know what was going on. I know what the plan was, happening in full view. And trust me, if we do not dig in and keep the truth alive and back it up with research and put it out there, you're going to have this forever as part of our official history, that just, because of global warming, all these wildfires, oh my God, what a tragedy, and the truth will be buried. So thank God for Executive Intelligence Review. Thank God that these documents are still available. We can go back and look at them. But good luck getting them read or looked at in the international academic racket that has a stranglehold on the Western mind. Going forward, the following will show that the storming of the Bastille was an irregular warfare coup, similar to that of the burning of the German Reichstag on February 1933, and similar to the American Day of Infamy, September 11th, 2001. The poisonous effect of those three different events, although occurring in three different places and at three different times, is essentially the same. And I would agree with this. And then these little other side events, the burning of the Notre Dame, the arson that was the Notre Dame. Everyone seems to have forgotten about it. It's so odd. They just keep moving on, distracting us with ever more outrageous and tall tales, which, just as people start to get to the bottom of what's going on, we're on to another one, keeping people off balance. But there are those of us who are keeping score, and we do remember. And as what he's saying here now, their aim was to force populations to accept emergency measures under conditions of irregular warfare. Same with 9/11, right? The Patriot Act. In a broader strategic perspective, the Bastille coup was aimed at undoing the achievement of bringing the American Revolution to France, already accomplished by Bailly and Lafayette, and instead at imposing on France a British-style parliamentary system at the precise moment that the United States was celebrating the adoption of its Constitution. The Bailly-led actions of the National Assembly had rendered the Jacobin terror obsolete before it occurred, just as Lyndon LaRouche's New Bretton Woods policy renders obsolete today's Jacobin terrorist operations sponsored by modern-day Philippe Egalités, such as the British financier Teddy Goldsmith, targeting IMF and World Bank policies of the current period. It's the same people, it's the same struggle. It's been going on for 3,000 years. You can actually track it back that far. Same tactics. The thing is, today, people are ever, rather than people waking up, it seems like people, as Aldous Huxley prognosticated, that people would learn to love their servitude. And indeed, it looks as though they have learned to love it, and to take their Prozac, and to watch their CNN, and to be led by the nose. The French, number one, the French paradox, why in 1789 France should have become a republican monarchy. During a dinner held at the home of Marshal de Beauvais on December 29, 1786, 3 years before the Estates General were established, Jean-Sylvain Baille forecast the coming into being of the National Assembly and began to envisage the role that he might be called to play in order to save the nation from being ruined. Upon hearing the creation of an assembly of the notables, he recalled how he was stunned by the news and recorded this astonishing forethought. I had forecast a great event, a change in the affairs of state, and even in the form of government. I did not forecast the revolution as it happened, and I don't believe that any man was able to forecast it. However, the deplorable state of the finances was sufficient to support my hypothesis. The need for money caused the government to be weak and dependent. The governed then had an immense advantage, such that I presumed we would be wise enough to take advantage of. This assembly of 150 citizens of all classes, including the most distinguished who had become responsible for the most important affairs of the state, could not miss the opportunity of creating a great reform. That assembly, that gathering, was in the image of the nation. It was a group of citizens deliberating less on the matters of the state than on their own interests. In recent years, the best minds had turned their meditations toward political economy, and the assembly, convened to enlighten and advise on the administration of the kingdom, naturally had to bring together all the minds on this question and bring this matter before the entire nation. Thus, when, after a long slumber, or rather after an absence, one comes to realize that our affairs had been quite dilapidated, it is difficult to forget that we have the right to bring them into order. I was, therefore, not forecasting a revolution, but a change, which, without being able to determine its specific character, had to be to the advantage of the nation. When, in a century of enlightenment, one calls on reason to help, reason must ultimately become the master. So we have the situation today very similar, except we do have Trump, and he's bringing the Federal Reserve to heel. He's bringing the authority, the previously unquestioned authority of the Federal Reserve under the rubric of the Treasury, and he's controlling it, and he's pulling power away from these people. And in fact, what we're looking at as a planet is a revolt against the central banking system, which is everywhere. And what Trump succeeds in doing in the United States will have a big impact on this global struggle. So, anyway, moving on. In many of his reflections on the nature of the National Assembly, Bai repeatedly turned to the idea of privilege, that the privilege of an arbitrary aristocracy had to be replaced by the nobility of the soul, that is, the privilege to serve by representing the nation. Bai attributed this qualitative change to the power of reason, but most significantly to the Leibnizian form of the principle of reason, as was made explicit in Leibniz's discovery of the calculus. This discovery of principle also applied to the rebirth of the nation, as Bai identified it, not as a revolution, but as a great change, a regeneration of the nation. Absolutely striking words here, you know? There is an impulse towards regeneration, toward reform, towards a changing of course, toward a genuine reformation that gets hijacked by bankers who fund and run anarchic, troublemaking, bloodthirsty movements that put the people through the grinder, really. Then they dress it up in fancy terms. They call it a revolution. And who ends up on top? The same people who were on top before. And we don't wise up to it. Or at least most people are not wise to it. Still, today, it's absolutely horrific. Moving on. This assembly, an infinitely small portion of the nation, felt nonetheless the force and the rights of the whole. It did not dissimulate the fact that it was acquiring for itself a sort of authority as a result of these rights and of this force as can be attained by the particular wills intended to compose the general will. End of quote here. Moreover, Bai realized that the constitution of the assembly could not be postponed indefinitely. It had to act quickly. Many obstacles had to be overcome, not the least of which was the fear of being killed in the process. Bai writes, and there are, of course, many attempts on Trump's life that don't get covered, and the truth of them and their exact character has not been revealed. But I think there have been somewhere in the neighborhood of at least 12 attempts on his life. And we have definitely a kind of new iteration of this Jacobin horde among these sort of NGO color revolution type of irregular warfare shock troops funded by international bankers, specifically George Soros. Anyway, moving on, Bai writes, the assembly was in a hurry to establish itself. We were told that the government was not happy with the firmness that the Commons displayed, and the fear was that it could go beyond what the Estates General had been accustomed to do up until that time. Backed up with a legal representation of at least the majority of the communes of the kingdom, such an assembly had become formidable because it was capable of executing any defensive actions since it had the power to give orders and was virtually assured of being obeyed. Bai's idea of the legitimacy of the National Assembly also included the idea of the legitimacy of the right of the king. So here we have proof that he was not simply, that he was of quite different, he was cut from a different cloth than the intriguers and the kind of mercenary, duplicitous forces that were being deployed against the nation of France by international banking criminals. From the very beginning, the members of the assembly had come to the agreement that the regeneration of the nation would be made in concert with His Majesty. And this is how Bai expressed what we can identify as the French paradox. I have to grant justice to this assembly. In her first acts and expressions of power, she had from that moment on acquired the wise principles which were expressed by the National Assembly in her most beautiful moments. sufficiently strong to think as the National Assembly in the times of her greatest power, sufficiently measured in her courage for not having gone beyond herself. The Assembly declared by this that she will accomplish the task of national regeneration in concert with His Majesty. She did not think that while restoring her rights, her own rights as a nation, she would have the king lose his own. The monarch has had all the authority for a long time. It was an usurpation that circumstances, necessity, as well as the succession of times had brought about, and it had, so to speak, been given an aura of legitimacy. However, in a monarchy, the prince could only exercise his legislative power, even abuse of it, as the representative of the people. And this is a quality that no one could take away from him. He had the right to run for the legislature, and when the National Assembly gave the suspending veto to the king, when it declared him the hereditary representative of the nation, it was developing the ideas whose principles are represented by the decisions of today. Here we have the very bad reproduction of, I'll find a better one. There it is, the painting, whereby leads the National Assembly in swearing the tennis court oath of June 20th, 1789, establishing the sovereignty of the Assembly in agreement with the principles of Benjamin Franklin's American Revolution. And this wonderful dream, this wonderful project was perverted. And that's an understatement. This is a crucial turning point in French history. The creation of a paradoxical monarchical republic in June 1789, this project of a constitutional monarchy was the only necessary and reasonable form of government that would have made it possible to move next toward a true republic without bloodshed. So we'll leave it there, without bloodshed. This is what we're trying to avoid in the United States. This is what Trump has avoided in the Middle East, and avoided war with North Korea, and avoided conflict with Russia, and stood firmly against wars that only benefit the international banking criminals. So we'll pick up next time. Hope all is well.